This is another podcast from Alpha Business Media. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating and often challenging journey into the heart of a nation's ambitious transformation, Nepal.
That's right.
Sometimes a country reaches the point where it just has to hit the reset button on its entire governance system. And Nepal did just that after a really tumultuous decade. We're going to unpack what happened when they swapped a highly centralized government for a brand new, multi-tiered federal system.
Indeed. Our mission today is to go beyond the headlines, really dive deep into Nepal's bold experiment with federalism, now 7 years on.
7 years already, wow.
Yeah, time flies. And we've meticulously combed through, a stack of reports, expert analyses, hard data detailing the very real successes, but also the unexpected stumbles and the significant unresolved problems. These things directly affect the daily lives of millions and, importantly, the country's investment climate, too.
Right.
This isn't just about political architecture. It's about how governance touches every single person, every business, and every corner of Nepal.
So if you've ever wondered what happens when a country tries to tackle deep-rooted inequalities and the scars of civil conflict through a massive decentralization effort, well, this deep dive is absolutely for you.
Definitely.
We'll explore the big why, the detailed how, and maybe most importantly, the tangible so what of Nepal's unique path to a new statehood. Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp the gravity here, we need to rewind a bit.
Right.
Back to September 20, 2015. That's when Nepal adopted its new constitution.
A landmark day.
Absolutely. But before that, what was the underlying tension? What was the driving force that made federalism seem like the ultimate answer?
What's truly critical to understand here is that for Nepal, federalism wasn't just some administrative tweak,
Right, not just shuffling papers.
Not at all, or some fashionable global trend. It was, in fact, the very cornerstone of the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Agreement.
The deal that ended the Civil War.
Exactly. The deal that finally brought an end to a bloody, decade-long civil war that raged from 96 to 2006. The old unitary system with power rigidly concentrated in Kathmandu, Singh Durbar, that symbolic seat of power. It had profoundly marginalized vast rural areas. And numerous ethnic groups, too, people like the Madhisi, Tharas, Dalits, both politically and economically.
So that marginalization was a key cause of the conflict itself.
A core driver, absolutely.
Yeah.
This wasn't just inequality, it fueled the fighting.
So the new constitution aimed to deconstruct the existing centralized and unitary structure and bring perpetual peace, good governance, development, and prosperity. That's a huge promise, a massive aspiration for a nation.
It was an immense undertaking. The goal was nothing less than addressing these age-old problems.
Oh.
Deep-rooted regional inequalities, systemic discrimination based on caste, class, gender, ethnicity, region.
All of it.
All of it. But look, the path was rocky from day one. Even the Constitution's adoption itself sparked widespread protests in the southern region.
Right, I remember that.
Which then led to a months-long economic blockade by India.
Oof.
Yeah, that dealt a severe blow to Nepal's already fragile economy. It just underscored how deeply divided the nation still was, even on this path to peace.
So with all that difficult history, that context, how did they actually design this new system? What does the architecture of power look like now in Nepal?
Well, the 2015 Constitution fundamentally overhauled the entire state structure. It created this complex three-tier federal system.
3 tiers, okay.
And this model wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was developed after a quite extensive study of 28 other federal states worldwide.
Learning from others.
Trying to, yes, all designed with one core aim: bring power and governance closer to the people.
3 tiers, you say. Can you break that down for us? Paint a clearer picture.
Certainly. So at the top, you have the federal government, still based in Kathmandu, handling the big national stuff.
Okay.
Below that, 7 provincial governments, each with its own regional focus.
7 provinces.
And then, and here's where it gets really transformative, a vast network of 753 local authorities.
753, wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. These local bodies are further broken down into metropolitan areas, urban municipalities, and rural municipalities, the Ganpalikas.
Well, Palikas.
What's absolutely crucial here is the unprecedented delegation of powers, especially down to this local level.
So the Constitution outlines specific powers for each level. Give us a few examples of who controls what. How's that division of labor work?
Okay. The federal level has 35 exclusive powers. Things like defense, foreign policy, the monetary
The
system.
big picture stuff.
Exactly. The provincial level gets 21 exclusive powers, managing things like provincial police, regional tourism, provincial roads, that sort of thing.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The local level was given 22 exclusive powers.
22 for the local guys.
Yes, effectively making them full-fledged local governments. They handle city police, local taxes like property tax, basic and secondary education, and basic health services, right there in the community.
That's a lot of responsibility to push down. And then there are joint powers, which always sound complicated.
They are. They really are. These are set out in Schedules 7 and 9 of the Constitution. They cover areas like civil and criminal law, social security, natural resource management. And this is where analysts point to a significant flaw, often called an hourglass structure.
Hourglass. How so?
Well, you see, the federal center at the top and the local governments at the bottom have significant, pretty clearly defined powers.
Yeah.
Strong top, strong base.
Okay.
But the intermediate provincial level, it's relatively weak, kind of squeezed in the middle, ill-defined in many areas.
Creating a vacuum.
Exactly. And what happens in a vacuum? Often, the federal center steps back in, undermining the whole decentralization goal. It also leads to extensive gray areas. Jurisdictional conflicts, like who's really responsible for managing this forest? How do we split tourism income? It becomes a source of constant friction.
It sounds like a challenging setup, almost inherently conflicted. But you mentioned there have been some real successes, too. Where has federalism delivered for Nepal?
Yeah, despite all the difficulties and, let's be honest, resistance from the center, the project isn't a failure. Not by a long shot.
Okay.
The most undeniable success: the restoration of democracy at the grassroots level.
That's huge.
It is. Local elections in 2017 and 2022 ended nearly 2 decades without elected local representatives. Imagine that, 20 years.
20 years with no local voice.
Exactly. Now, accountability and representation are finally back in Nepalese politics, at least at that local level. That's monumental.
Bringing power back to the people. What about inclusiveness? Bringing in those historically marginalized groups.
That's a really important question, right? How do you bring these groups into the fold? The federal system has definitely opened new opportunities for groups like the Medhisi, Dalits, Muslims.
Not just left out before.
Precisely. But the most striking example, gender representation. Constitutional quotas led to women making up 41% of elected representatives at the local level.
41%. That's incredible.
It's a massive shift. Think about the impact on local policy, on community priorities when women have such a strong voice.
That's not just a statistic. It's a social revolution in itself. And beyond representation, have there been tangible improvements in daily life? Infrastructure, services.
Absolutely. Even with capacity limits, provincial governments have implemented significant infrastructure projects. Karnali Province, for example, built 215 kilometers of paved roads.
Right.
Sudarpasham Province, 550 kilometers. Lumbini, over 11,160 kilometers.
Wow, that's serious road building.
These aren't just numbers. These roads connect remote communities, improve trade, enable access. Plus, World Bank-supported projects provided clean drinking water to over 1.4 million people in rural areas.
Clean water, basic roads, fundamental stuff.
Foundational. And we're seeing unique social innovations, too, like Bagmati Province's One Public School, One Nurse initiative, directly tackling student health.
And has public administration seen any modernization? Any efficiency gains?
Yes, definitely some steps forward. With partners like the Asian Development Bank, Nepal introduced an electronic public procurement system, EGP.
Making things more transparent.
Much more transparent and efficient. Reducing costs, cutting corruption risks. They also developed Sutura, a system for local financial management.
Sutura.
Yeah, it covers planning, budgeting, reporting, gives a modern, structured basis for financial governance locally. So, look, at this stage, despite the challenges, federalism has undeniably proven its worth. As an instrument of democratization, inclusion, peace building, it stood real strides.
Okay, so clear progress on the political side, representation, some infrastructure. But the source material also talks about systemic failures. That slogan, Singh Durbar in every village, the central power in every village described as an unfulfilled dream. What went wrong, or what's still going wrong?
Well, the primary obstacle, when you boil it down, has been the stubborn resistance of the federal government and the central bureaucracy in Kathmandu.
The old guard.
You could say that. Despite clear constitutional provisions, the old elites seem to maintain this centralized mindset. They seem unwilling to share real power. especially control over resources.
Money and control.
Always. You see this in the deliberate delays in passing crucial laws. Laws on federal civil service, on education, they've been stuck for years.
Leaving the provinces in limbo.
Exactly. Provinces and municipalities are left in this legal limbo, unable to fully use the powers the Constitution supposedly gave them.
That sounds like a fundamental problem. What's at the root of most of these issues then?
A glaring fiscal imbalance. It really comes down to the money.
Okay.
The federal government still collects the vast majority of national income estimates range from 85% to 92%.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the provinces and those 753 local governments who are responsible for providing most basic services, they get only a small share. Local budgets, for instance, are something like 78% made up of grants and transfers from Kathmandu.
So financial dependence is a huge hurdle. It's a chokehold, really.
It is. And to make matters worse, the center prefers conditional grants.
Meaning strings attached.
Exactly. The funds can only be spent on predetermined purposes decided in Kathmandu. This severely limits local autonomy, their ability to address unique local needs.
Right.
In 2023, provinces and local governments even saw their fiscal balance dip into deficit for the first time since the reform. That's a worrying sign.
Definitely.
And this financial stranglehold leads directly to low institutional capacity, shortages of personnel locally. We're talking up to 35% vacancy rates in provincial administrations, over 250 municipalities lacking administrative heads.
So they don't even have the people to spend the money they do get.
Precisely. It results in chronic underutilization of even the meager funds they receive. It's a vicious cycle.
And perhaps the most concerning failure mentioned is the decentralization of corruption. That sounds ominous.
It is unsettling. What's apparently happened is that corruption schemes, once concentrated in Kathmandu, have now spread to the provincial and local levels. The lack of effective control, weak accountability, lack of transparency, it's created fertile ground for abuse.
So corruption isn't gone, it's just moved.
In many ways, yes, it's almost institutionalized corruption down to individual rural districts. This creates a vicious circle where central elites maintain control and unscrupulous local actors can benefit from the chaos. It fundamentally undermines the whole promise of local empowerment.
So we have this mixed picture: successes in democracy, representation, failures in finance, administration, and now decentralized corruption. What does this mean for the quality of life for ordinary Nepalese citizens? Is it better? Worse?
The picture is extremely heterogeneous. It really varies wildly depending on where you are.
Okay.
While some macro indicators show positive dynamics, life expectancy is up, for example.
Right.
A closer look at key sectors like health and education reveals a much less rosy situation.
Okay, let's take health and education. Critical services.
Right. In healthcare, devolving basic care to the local level was supposed to improve access. That was the theory.
Makes sense.
In practice, often near chaos. Poor coordination between the tiers, duplication of effort, funding delays, severe shortages of staff and medicines, especially in remote mountain areas. Quality care is just inaccessible for many.
And education.
Similar story. Basic and secondary education were devolved to local governments. But that legal vacuum we talked about, plus the financial dependence, it means unresolved questions about teacher hiring, curricula, standards.
So locals can't really shape their own schools.
Very difficult. Apparently, up to 91% of the education budget transferred locally is notional. Its distribution is basically predetermined by Kathmandu. Very little local flexibility.
That makes it incredibly tough for local areas to respond to their unique needs. What about the development gap, that divide between cities and rural areas?
That was a key target for federalism. Address that gap.
Has it worked?
Largely, no. Despite some successes in road building, federalization has mostly failed to bridge this huge divide. Some analysts even suggest it might be worsening.
Really?
Worsening! That's the concern. The expected investment and rapid development in rural areas, it just didn't materialize, often due to inefficient fund use and, yes, corruption again.
So young people still leave the villages?
In droves. For cities or abroad, draining rural areas, it highlights a critical point.
Yeah.
Improvements seem to happen mainly where local authorities have clear exclusive powers.
Like building a road.
Exactly. Specific, measurable projects. Where powers are joint or vague, that's where you see stagnation and chaos persist.
Okay, let's shift perspective. For businesses, particularly foreign investors, how has Nepal's move to federalism impacted the investment climate? New risks, new opportunities.
For the business community, it's a whole new reality, a new ballgame. The old risks, political instability, corruption, bureaucracy, they haven't gone away.
Still there.
Oh, yes. And in some ways, federalization has created new challenges. The main one, tax uncertainty. With all three levels of government, federal, provincial, local, now able to levy taxes, and no clear federal framework, well, provinces and local bodies interpret their powers uniquely.
I think
A confusing mess of different fees, and a real risk of double, maybe even triple taxation for companies operating across different regions. Imagine trying to budget for that.
So navigating taxes is much more complex now, a potential minefield.
Exactly. And administrative procedures, too, more complicated. Instead of one center in Kathmandu, businesses now potentially deal with 7 provincial and 753 local regulators.
Wow.
The bureaucratic burden has increased significantly. Registering a business, for instance, now involves multiple steps at different levels. It's time-consuming, costly.
So paradoxically, decentralization led to more complexity for business.
In many ways, yes. A multiplication of risks, as some sources put it. The unpredictability, dealing with potentially hundreds of regulators. It's become a bigger barrier, perhaps, than the old centralized system for some investors.
But there must be opportunities too, right? It can't all be negative.
Absolutely. There are opportunities. One major one is the growth of regional markets. As population and economic activity slowly disperse from Kathmandu to provincial capitals, new consumer markets are emerging. That's a strategic opportunity for businesses, especially in services, retail, construction, carving out niches.
And competition between provinces.
That's starting too, albeit slowly. Provinces beginning to compete for investment, offering special incentives, maybe more favorable rules based on their priority sectors. That could create a healthy, competitive dynamic over time.
And has the federal government done anything to streamline things at their end?
Yes, some important steps have been taken. The Foreign Investment and Technology Transfer Act, FITA, simplified some procedures. FDI approval, profit repatriation.
Okay.
And a single window service center was created to help foreign investors navigate the federal bureaucracy.
So some progress.
Some positive developments, yes. But they haven't yet outweighed the broader economic challenges. Unstable growth hovering around 4%, well below the 7% needed for a real leap. A huge trade deficit, imports dwarf exports by over 10 times, and worrying deindustrialization trends. Investing in Nepal. It still requires a high-risk appetite. It's not for the faint of heart.
So after 7 years of this grand experiment,
Yeah.
what's the ultimate verdict? Nepali federalism? Success, failure, or something in between?
It's really neither a clear success nor a complete failure. It's extremely complex, contradictory, and most importantly, it's an unfinished project.
Unfinished.
Definitely. On one hand, you have those undeniable political results, local democracy restored, big gains in representation for women, marginalized groups. Those are fundamental achievements. They've strengthened peace, stability.
And people aren't talking about scrapping it.
Exactly. The discussion now is about refining federalism, not abolishing it. That shows it's taken root.
But on the economic and social fronts, as you've laid out, the picture is much more mixed.
Precisely. It hasn't brought the hoped-for economic breakthrough or widespread poverty reduction. Instead, it's created new problems. Fiscal chaos, decentralized corruption, more bureaucracy for business. Key services like healthcare, education, still suffering from confusion, underfunding, uneven quality. International partners, World Bank, ADB, they've identified the root causes and given clear recommendations.
What are those key recommendations? What needs to happen now?
They mostly boil down to 3 crucial things. First, reform interbudgetary transfers, increase unconditional grants, give subnational governments real financial autonomy, let them plan for local needs, not just follow Kathmandu's orders.
Makes sense.
Second,
clear delineation of powers. Finally pass those missing federal laws. Eliminate the ambiguities and shared competencies. Stop the jurisdictional fights.
and
Third, extensive capacity building. For provincial and local governments, in planning, budgeting, project management, they need the skills to actually use the power and money effectively. Nepal's government even has a roadmap based on a big study they did with the World Bank and UNDP.
So they know what needs doing.
The path is relatively clear. The question is political will.
So ultimately, what does this all mean for Nepal's future? Where is this journey heading? Well, the future of Nepalese federalism seems like it will be determined by this ongoing struggle, a tug of war, really, between 2 opposing forces. The centripetal force, that desire of Kathmandu's elite, to keep control using money and administrative levers, versus the centrifugal force, the growing demands from provinces, from local communities for real autonomy, backed by their constitutional rights and that democratic momentum they've gained.
So this raises a really profound question, doesn't it? Will Nepal successfully become a truly federal state, one capable of delivering balanced development, prosperity across its diverse regions?
Yeah.
Or will this complex system remain, I guess, a kind of decorative decentralization, masking the old unitary core? For you, our listener, and anyone watching Nepal's future, understanding the dynamics of this core conflict, this push and pull, will be absolutely critical. It's a truly fascinating and ongoing story. It really highlights just how challenging it is to transform a nation from the ground up, especially after conflict. It leaves you wondering, how long can a system endure with such deep internal contradictions? And what lessons might other nations, considering similar ambitious reforms, take away from Nepal's 7-year experiment?
Indeed. The journey is far from over, and the final chapter certainly hasn't been written.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Nepal's federalism. We really hope it's given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of this remarkable country's ongoing transformation. Until next time, keep digging deeper into the world around you.